This is Australia, and not long ago, local geologists drilled deep underground and found what seemed like oceans of pristine, high-quality crude oil. You'd think that would be the dream. Just pump it out, make your own gasoline, and enjoy life. But unfortunately for Australians, it's not that simple. Instead, they sit on the coast, staring out at the water and anxiously waiting for foreign tankers carrying imported fuel. It costs an enormous amount of money, and there's always the risk that supplies could suddenly be cut off. In short, it's not a great situation. So how does a country with oil right under its feet end up almost completely dependent on foreign fuel? Let's find out. If you look at global production figures, Australia has never exactly been the Saudi Arabia of the industry. You know, one of those classic oil kingdoms where you poke a finger into the sand and a black fountain immediately shoots up into the sky. No, the reality there was far less impressive. But it would still be wrong to say that such a huge continent had no resources to speak of. Here's how it all started. The Australians struck their first commercial oil in 1961 at the Moonee Field in Queensland. By global standards, the output was almost laughable, just a couple of thousand barrels a day. But the discovery gave the country a serious confidence boost. People thought, wow, there's something under our feet after all. That means we need to keep drilling. And they did. Australia hit the real jackpot a little later when geologists moved to the far southeast of the country and ventured into Bass Strait in the Gippsland Basin. That was where the serious game began. They started building enormous offshore platforms right in the middle of a stormy ocean and pumping oil on a massive scale. As a result, in the 1980s and 1990s, Australia had it pretty good. At its peak, the country was able to cover as much as 70% of its own oil needs, and at certain points, even 84%. Nearly all the gasoline and diesel for its cars, trucks, and tractors was produced at home from its own crude oil. At the time, the authorities were actively developing oil refineries and were completely convinced that the country was protected from any global crisis, war, or trouble in the Middle East. The idea was let people on the other side of the planet fight all they want. We've got our own pipeline, so it's none of our concern. But there's one harsh truth behind every oil success story. Sooner or later, it ends, unless you keep finding new fields. By the early 2000s, those old giant deposits had begun to dry up fast. Water started flooding the reservoirs, production collapsed several times over, and there was simply nothing left to pump from the old wells. That was when Australia had to switch abruptly to imports and start buying huge quantities of expensive foreign fuel from overseas. Once the traditional oil-producing regions in the south had finally run out of steam, geologists turned their attention back to the east of the country, to the vast Surat-Bowen Basin. But the funny thing is, they weren't originally looking for oil there at all. For decades, this basin in Queensland was basically Australia's great national boiler room. If you'd shown up there sometime around 1995 and told the local workers you'd come looking for major oil reserves, they would have looked at you like you were out of your mind. What kind of oil, buddy? That wasn't what this place was about. The thing is, for decades, this land had been famous for its enormous, almost obscene deposits of coal. And there was no real need to bother with complicated, dangerous underground mines. People simply brought in excavators the size of apartment buildings, dug vast open pit mines under the open sky, and shipped out millions of tons of coal for export. Essentially, the region supplied energy to half of Asia, but entirely in a solid black form. Then the 21st century arrived and a new spectacular boom swept through the Surat-Bowen Basin. Engineers realized that enormous amounts of invisible gas were trapped inside those coal seams, almost like water in a porous sponge. It's known as coal bed methane. And that was when a new gold rush began. Companies moved in with drilling rigs and sank thousands upon thousands of wells across the state to suck that gas out of the ground. There was so much methane that the Australians decided to go big. They laid pipelines across hundreds of miles of wilderness, all the way to the coastal port of Gladstone. And there, on the shoreline, they built 3 gigantic liquefied natural gas plants worth tens of billions of dollars. The gas was chilled until it turned into liquid, pumped into enormous tankers, and shipped off to Asian markets. But amid all this resource frenzy, one rule became firmly lodged in the minds of geologists and major industry bosses alike. Everyone knew for certain that the Surat-Bowen Basin was, first and foremost, about gas and coal. So what did oil have to do with any of it? Well, as it turns out, there's oil there too. Right in the middle of this peaceful gas and coal paradise in the east of the continent, something truly sensational happened. It happened in the deepest central part of the basin, an area scientists call the Taroom Trough. That was where Elixir Energy and Omega Oil and Gas came in and decided to do something that had previously seemed pointless: drill far deeper than anyone normally would. Usually, companies mined the coal and extracted the gas from relatively shallow formations, but these guys brought in some seriously powerful rigs and drilled to a completely insane, extreme depth, more than 2.2 miles, and in some places as deep as 2.5 miles below the surface. They had to break through dense sandstone formations almost as hard as solid concrete. It was brutally difficult and expensive work, with the equipment pushed to its absolute limit because of the enormous underground pressure and heat. And when they finally reached those depths and brought up the first samples, analysts on the exchange couldn't believe their eyes. The test results stunned the country's entire energy market. Turned out that the deep formations of the Taroom Trough weren't just saturated with dry gas, they contained huge amounts of highly valuable liquid hydrocarbons. They found light crude oil and a whole lot of gas condensate. When the experts sat down and started crunching the numbers, they were, well, blown away. Preliminary estimates suggested that billions of barrels of liquid oil equivalent could be lying down there. But the most important thing wasn't even the quantity, it was the quality. Chemically, this oil is exceptionally clean, with almost no sulfur in it. For refineries, that makes it a true premium-grade crude, the kind that can be turned into vast amounts of high-quality gasoline and jet fuel without a lot of extra complicated processing. You'd think this was it, the salvation of the Australian economy. The key to complete fuel independence had finally been found. Time to celebrate and shut down imports. But even all this oil won't change one thing: Australia's dependence on tankers arriving from overseas. How's that even possible when the country's found such perfect raw material? And the answer lies in one very sad and very ordinary fact. It isn't enough to simply find perfect crude oil deep underground and pump it to the surface. Oil has to be refined, heated, separated into different products, and turned into usable gasoline, diesel, or jet fuel. And that requires special facilities called oil refineries. And this is where things go completely off the rails for Australia. Back at the end of the 20th century, everything looked fairly decent and secure. 8 major refineries were operating across the country. They were located in different states, processing crude oil and covering almost all of Australia's fuel needs. The country could sleep soundly, but then the 21st century arrived, along with the harsh realities of the global market. Australia sits right next to Asia, where in recent years enormous ultramodern refineries have been built in places like Singapore, India, and South Korea. These Asian megacomplexes began churning out finished fuel on such a colossal scale that the cost of producing a gallon of gasoline became incredibly low. Australia's older, smaller refineries simply couldn't compete with these giants on price. Operating them no longer made economic sense. As a result, their owners began suffering huge losses, gave up, and started shutting the refineries down one by one. The final wave of this collapse came very recently, in 2021, when 2 more critically important facilities closed. Their owners crunched the numbers and decided it was far more profitable to turn the refineries into storage terminals for imported finished fuel than to keep producing anything themselves. After this brutal crisis, only 2 of the original 8 refineries were left standing in the entire enormous country. The Lytton Refinery in Brisbane on the East Coast and the Geelong Refinery in the southern state of Victoria. And as if having just 2 refineries weren't bad enough, they're aging facilities, and their actual capacity is little more than a drop in the ocean for a continent this vast. Today, Australia consumes around 1 million barrels of various petroleum products every single day. And even if those 2 surviving refineries ran around the clock at full capacity, they still couldn't supply even a quarter of that amount. Fine, these 2 refineries are small, outdated, and unreliable, but at least they're actually located on the continent. Couldn't Australia simply spend the money to modernize them and salvage at least some refining capacity? Well, there's another catch. To understand it, you have to look at a map of Australia not through the eyes of a tourist, but through the eyes of an engineer or a geologist. The Taroom Trough lies deep inside the continent, in the real Australian wilderness, which the locals call the outback. It's hundreds of miles of sparsely populated, arid land where the only infrastructure to speak of is kangaroos, the occasional dirt road, and a few tiny worker settlements. Natural barriers and vast distances leave this place completely cut off from the country's major cities and industrial centers. At the same time, Australia's 2 surviving oil refineries, along with its main fuel consumers, are located right on the coast, far away from this remote interior. The Brisbane refinery is at least in the same state, Queensland, but the second refinery in Geelong is located at the very southern end of the continent, in the state of Victoria. The straight line distance between them is enormous. And here's the crucial detail. Australia simply doesn't have a developed network of major oil pipelines capable of pumping crude across the entire continent from inland areas to the southern coast. Unlike the United States or Russia, where pipelines stretch for thousands of miles across the country, Australia never built that kind of infrastructure for liquid crude because it never really needed it. So the whole thing becomes a dead end. The oil is buried deep in the interior, while the refineries are sitting by the water. Moving such massive volumes of liquid crude across the country in thousands of huge tanker trucks along rough roads would be economic insanity. The cost of transportation alone would immediately send the price of Australian fuel through the roof, making it more expensive than imported gasoline from Singapore. But all right, Australia could build a pipeline from the field to Brisbane. Yes, it would be expensive, but at least the local refinery would be able to process some of the oil, and the crude could then be loaded onto tankers and shipped by sea to the second refinery in Victoria. And that's where, on the coast, Australia runs into its second critical dead end. Despite being a giant island nation completely dependent on sea routes, Australia has somehow managed to lose almost its entire sovereign merchant fleet. If we look at the official maritime registries, we find something remarkable. Today, Australia has very few tankers sailing under its own flag and operated by Australian crews. How did that happen? It all comes down to the country's extremely strict maritime laws, heavy domestic taxation, and the high wages paid to Australian seafarers. For local companies, maintaining their own vessels simply stopped making financial sense. As a result, over the past 30 years, the country's merchant fleet has effectively melted away, replaced by cheaper foreign carriers. That creates a legal trap. To transport oil, for example, from a port in Queensland to a port in Victoria, in other words, to carry out a domestic voyage, Australia either has to use one of its own ships, which it barely has, or go through highly complicated bureaucratic procedures and hire foreign vessels sailing under flags of convenience such as Liberia, Panama, or the Marshall Islands. The country's found itself completely and utterly dependent on foreign shipping, even within its own sovereign waters. If the refineries can't handle the job, there's no inland infrastructure, and there's no domestic fleet to transport the oil, then what's the actual plan? What exactly are the extraction companies supposed to do with all that oil from the Taroom trough? To find the real answer to this question, all you have to do is open the official annual reports of Elixir Energy and Omega Oil and Gas. The strategy of these companies is highly pragmatic, commercially sound, and, to be honest, rather cynical when it comes to Australia's national energy security. The directors of private corporations have no intention of spending billions of their own money on building new oil refineries on the continent. Their actual plan is much simpler. Right next to the Taroom Trough lies Wallumbilla, the largest gas distribution hub in eastern Australia. It's a vast crossroads of pipelines where gas from across the region flows in. The companies simply intend to connect their new deep wells to this existing, fully operational infrastructure. The gas that comes out alongside the oil will be sent through pipelines to the domestic market, where it'll be used to heat Australian homes, as well as to the 3 giant LNG plants at the Port of Gladstone. But the liquid oil and valuable condensate will be handled differently. The liquid fraction will be separated from the gas right at the production site using special separators. The condensate and light crude oil will then be loaded into tankers and transported along existing local rail lines and short pipelines to the ports of Brisbane and Gladstone. From there, straight from the port terminals, this unrefined, high-quality Australian crude will be sold directly to Asia for export without any processing in Australia. In other words, it'll simply be loaded onto those very same foreign tankers and shipped off to the mega refineries of Singapore and South Korea. Foreign companies will refine it and keep the added value, while Australia will then buy the finished fuel back from them. The raw material will sail off to Asia, while Australia continues to live with severe fuel shortages and serious supply risks. And that raises the obvious question: just how deep is this oil and fuel hole? And where exactly are Australians hiding their strategic reserves? Because in today's world, anything can happen. To understand just how deep this problem goes, we need to look at the rules of the International Energy Agency, of which Australia is a member. Under its strict requirements, every developed industrial nation must maintain an emergency strategic reserve of oil or fuel sufficient to cover at least 90 days. This stockpile is meant for worst-case scenarios, war, a global blockade, or a major natural disaster, so the economy doesn't grind to a halt within the very first week. For years, Australia was in serious breach of this international requirement. The fuel stored within the country itself was enough to keep things running normally for, at best, 20 to 30 days. Building massive new underground or above-ground storage facilities at home would be enormously expensive and take years. But the government still had to find some way to fix this critical security issue, and that's when the Australian authorities came up with and signed a truly unprecedented and astonishing deal. They officially purchased millions of barrels of crude oil and rented storage space for it in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the United States of America. That's right, part of Australia's official fuel stockpile is physically stored in deep salt caverns along the coasts of Texas and Louisiana. That's roughly 8,700 miles from Canberra on an entirely different continent across a vast ocean. It sounds insane. And yet, Australia's fuel dependence problem gets even crazier. Right now, the country's entire economy, its entire transport system, and the basic functioning of everyday life are completely dependent on a constant flow of huge ocean-going tankers. Refined diesel, jet fuel, and gasoline are shipped to Australia, primarily from major Asian refineries in South Korea, Singapore, and Japan. Every day, these vessels leave port and head south. But their journey is far from a simple voyage across calm, safe waters. Their route runs through the South China Sea and through the narrow, congested straits of the Indonesian archipelago, such as the Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok Straits. Today, these are some of the world's highest-risk geopolitical flashpoints, where military tensions between global superpowers are rising almost by the month. Should any serious conflict break out in the region, or should these narrow shipping lanes simply be blocked as a result of military operations, Australia would immediately be cut off from its supplies. Without deliveries of refined diesel, life across the continent would come to a standstill within weeks because trucks would no longer be able to deliver food to supermarkets. So are the authorities doing anything at all to fix this situation? To be fair, they did honestly try to do something about it. In 2023, officials formally brought in a set of tough new rules with the very clever-sounding name Minimum Stockholding Obligation, or MSO for short. Under this government mandate, every major private company importing fuel into the country, along with Australia's 2 remaining oil refineries, is now legally required to keep a minimum untouchable reserve of fuel on Australian soil at all times. For regular gasoline and jet fuel, they set a strict minimum of 24 days supply. In other words, if something goes wrong and imports are disrupted, the country should be able to survive on those reserves for almost a month. Over time, the requirements became even stricter for diesel, the essential fuel that keeps trucks and tractors running. But another problem came up right away. The idea was great, but private companies simply didn't have the physical space to store oceans of liquid fuel in the first place. It's not like you can just pour it into buckets. So the government had to open its wallet once again, launch a major subsidy program, and allocate hundreds of millions of dollars from the budget to help expand diesel storage capacity. With this government funding, private companies began rapidly building enormous new storage tanks. These giant barrels started appearing at the country's most important port hubs, and it really did help improve fuel security a little, allowing hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel to be stockpiled right on the coast. But everyone understands perfectly well that this is only a temporary patch, a way to buy a little time in the event of a real crisis, not a solution to the underlying problem. After all, storage tanks don't magically turn into refineries, and the country still has almost no domestic production of its own. So, since things are looking so bleak when it comes to conventional oil in refineries, why shouldn't Australia get creative and come up with some alternative ways of producing fuel? A technology called HVO, or diesel made from ordinary vegetable oil, is taking off around the world right now. It can be produced from everyday rapeseed oil, used cooking oil left over from frying French fries, or animal waste. Best of all, from a chemical standpoint, the stuff is no different from conventional diesel refined from oil. You can pour it straight into almost any tractor, truck, or train without making any modifications to the engine. And let's not forget that Australia is full of rapeseed. It grows and exports millions of tons of it all over the world. You would think this was the perfect solution. Press oil from your own rapeseed and produce cleaner diesel right at home. But once again, Australia is making the same old mistake. The country doesn't have a single large commercial plant capable of producing this fuel on a proper industrial scale. So the result is completely absurd. Australia dutifully loads its own rapeseed and crude oil onto ships and sends them thousands of miles away to Europe and the United States, where local refineries turn them into usable fuel. Meanwhile, Australians themselves continue obediently buying diesel from Asia. But some people are taking matters into their own hands. While officials in Canberra slowly shuffle papers on new legislation, the real hard-nosed bosses of the Australian economy have decided, that's it, from now on we're relying on ourselves. We're talking about giant mining corporations such as BHP, Rio Tinto, and Fortescue. These companies dig enormous open-pit mines in the remote deserts of Western Australia and Queensland, extracting millions of tons of iron ore and coal. And to keep this colossal machine moving at all, they burn through almost unimaginable amounts of diesel fuel every single day. Fuel is poured by the gallon into mining trucks the size of 3-story buildings and into massive locomotives hauling ore to the coast. The executives running these resource empires understand perfectly well if imported diesel suddenly stopped arriving tomorrow, their entire business would grind to a halt overnight, and the losses would be so enormous they might as well shut down. That's exactly why they've switched into emergency mode and launched an all-out effort to decarbonize their operations. And they're not doing it because they've suddenly become passionate environmentalists. They're doing it purely to save themselves. They're now investing astronomical sums in fully electric haul trucks powered by enormous batteries, while also aggressively testing heavy-duty hydrogen trains. Right in the middle of the scorched, empty desert, these mining giants are building vast private fields of solar panels and wind turbines. Their plan is simple: shift all their heavy machinery to clean, self-generated, independent electricity so they can forget about buying fuel once and for all, stop depending on shuttered refineries, and never again wait anxiously for tankers arriving from overseas. And this is what it all comes down to. The example of the Taroom trough and this entire fuel dead end exposes one of the central myths of modern global geopolitics. Simply being rich in natural resources never guarantees real security. You can have billions of barrels of high-quality light crude oil right beneath your feet, but if at the same time you've shut down almost all your refineries, destroyed your own merchant fleet, and lost the ability to turn raw resources into usable fuel yourself, you still remain a vulnerable and defenseless continent in the middle of a raging ocean. In today's unforgiving world, true energy independence isn't about owning raw resources, it's about maintaining complete, uninterrupted control over the entire supply chain. From the first drilling rig in a distant desert to the gas pump nozzle at the filling station.